The war on the Uranthian homeworld had dragged on for years. For the people of Uranthia, it had started as a struggle, something they thought they could handle. But as time went by, their hopes began to fade. The enemy, the Zlorians, were relentless. Their weapons, their tactics, and their numbers, everything seemed to give them an overwhelming advantage. The Uranthians had fought back as best they could, but with each passing day, it felt more and more like they were losing ground. The Uranthians had tried everything. They had reached out to their allies, hoping for help. They had sent messages, had tried to form alliances, but nothing seemed to work. The rest of the galaxy was either too busy with their own problems, or simply didn't care. The Uranthians were alone in their struggle, fighting a battle they seemed destined to lose. Every city on Uranthia was under siege. The enemy had already taken the outer colonies, and now they were closing in on the last strongholds of the Uranthian people. The skies were filled with smoke and fire, and the once vibrant cities had turned into cold, desolate places. The people had been living in fear for so long that it almost felt normal. But that didn't mean they weren't desperate for a change. In one of the last remaining strongholds, a group of Uranthian leaders sat together in a dimly lit room. The air was thick with tension. No one knew what to do anymore. The fight was draining them, and their hope was running low. "We can't keep asking for help," one of the leaders said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one is coming. We have no allies left. If we don't do something now, we'll lose everything." Another leader nodded, but there was no certainty in her expression. "What can we do? We've sent out so many distress signals, and no one's responded. We're alone." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if they were all trying to come to terms with the fact that their world was slipping through their fingers. But then, one leader stood up. His eyes were filled with determination, and his voice had a weight to it as he spoke. "Perhaps we don't need to wait for someone we already know," he said. "Maybe it's time we reach out beyond what we've ever tried before." The room shifted. There was a spark of interest in the air. The leader continued, "We've exhausted every option with our allies. It's time we send a message to the unknown. Who knows who might answer? We need to cast our net wider. Maybe there's someone out there who can help us, even if we've never met them before." The others exchanged uncertain glances. It was a risky move. But what did they have to lose? If they kept waiting, they would only be signing their own extinction. They couldn't afford to be picky anymore. They needed help, and they needed it fast. So, with that decision, they agreed to send a last-ditch signal of broadcast to any and all who might hear it. The message wasn't addressed to any specific group or species. It was a simple, direct call for help. "Uranthia is under attack. We need assistance. We have no time left." They sent it out into the void, hoping for the best, but expecting nothing. The message traveled through the stars, a small beacon in the vast, empty space. Days passed, and there was no response. The Uranthians continued to fight on, but their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. They were waiting for a miracle, but none seemed to come. Then, on the 5th day after the message was sent, something unexpected happened. The silence was broken. The first response they received was faint, barely detectable. At first, it was nothing more than a strange set of signals coming from a distant corner of the galaxy. But as the transmission grew clearer, their excitement began to build. It wasn't just static. It was a message. The source was unknown, but the frequency was familiar. The message came through in a simple, blunt tone. "We heard your call. We are coming." There was no introduction, no formalities, just those words. The Uranthian leaders looked at one another, unsure of what to make of it. They had no idea who this was, what species they were dealing with, or what their intentions might be. But they didn't have the luxury of time to question it. All they knew was that someone had responded. The leader who had suggested reaching out beyond their known allies stood up again, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's them," he said quietly. "Someone has heard us. We have a chance." For the first time in weeks, the room was filled with hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The Aranthians didn't know who these mysterious responders were, but they knew they had to prepare for whatever was coming. There wasn't time to waste. The leader quickly ordered their best engineers and tacticians to begin preparing for the unknown. They had to be ready for anything. The enemy was closing in on their final stronghold, and every moment counted. As they worked to organize their forces and get their defenses in order, the mysterious fleet, whoever they were, began making their way toward Urantia. Days passed, and the tension only grew. The Uranthians had no idea what to expect. They had no knowledge of the fleet that was coming to their aid, no idea what kind of warriors or technologies they possessed. The fear of the unknown gnawed at them, but the hope of survival kept them moving forward. And then the moment arrived. It wasn't like the movies, with grand speeches or dramatic fanfare. There was no sudden burst of light or overwhelming fanfare. But what happened next would change everything. The first ship arrived in the Uranthian skies, a massive, imposing vessel, unlike anything they had ever seen. It was rough, angular, and looked built for combat. The ship's design was unlike anything in the Uranthian arsenal. It wasn't sleek or elegant like their own ships. It looked rugged, like it had been made to withstand the harshest conditions. As more ships followed, the Uranthians felt a mixture of awe and fear. These were not the kind of allies they had expected. But they had no choice now. The strangers were here. The ships hovered above Urantia, their engines humming with power. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. What would these strange beings do? Would they help, or would they take advantage of the Uranthians' weakened state? The tension was unbearable. But then the answer came not in words, but in actions. A signal was sent. The message was simple: prepare for war. The massive ships that appeared in the skies above Urantia were unlike anything the Uranthians had ever seen. They were unlike anything they had imagined. These weren't sleek, sophisticated vessels with the smooth curves of the Uranthian ships. No, these were rough, rugged machines built for strength, made to endure. The ships looked like they had been in battle many times before, their surfaces scratched and dented, with no sign of care for aesthetics. They looked like they had been built to survive in the toughest environments, perfect for a war-torn world like Urantia. The first ship was massive, dwarfing everything the Uranthians had seen before. It glided through the atmosphere like it was made for the harshest conditions. As it approached, the very air seemed to tremble with the power of its engines. The Uranthians had never felt such a presence so raw, so unapologetically strong. They were used to ships that were designed to be beautiful, sleek, and fast. But this was something different. A shiver ran through the people of Urantia as the ships began to land, one by one. There was no grand ceremony, no greeting, no speeches or diplomacy, just the silent landing of these strange ships. The atmosphere was thick with tension and curiosity. Who were these beings? What did they want? And more importantly, could they really help? Inside the control room, the Uranthian leaders watched as the first of the strange ships touched down. It was a monstrous thing, its hull scarred from countless battles. The crew inside the ship moved quickly, not with the grace of diplomats, but with the urgency of soldiers preparing for war. The doors of the ship opened, and out stepped the first of the humans. The first thing that struck the Uranthians was how human they looked. They didn't have the smooth, elegant features of the Uranthians, or the pristine armor of a galactic diplomat. These beings looked rough. Their clothing was not elegant or ceremonial, but practical military-style gear that was clearly made for combat. Their movements were quick and efficient, their eyes scanning the surroundings with a practiced awareness. They looked like soldiers, not diplomats. Their faces were serious, filled with purpose. The Uranthians couldn't help but feel a sense of awe, mixed with fear. The humans weren't like the other species they had encountered. There was no pomp or circumstance in their arrival. These were warriors, not negotiators. They didn't need to introduce themselves with words. Their presence alone told the Uranthians everything they needed to know. These were beings who had fought and survived on worlds much harsher than Uranthia worlds where danger was an everyday occurrence. They had fought on Deathworld's planets so hostile to life that they were considered uninhabitable by most species. The Uranthians had heard the rumors about these Deathworlders, but they had never imagined meeting them face-to-face. The leader of the humans stepped forward, his voice deep and calm. He spoke without any formalities, without any greeting. "We heard your call. We are here to help." The Uranthians didn't know what to think. They had expected help, but they hadn't expected this. This was no smooth-talking diplomat from an allied species, no polished negotiator. These humans were here to fight. The leader's words were blunt and to the point. There was no need for fancy speeches, no need for flattery. These people didn't need to win anyone off. All with charm. They were here for one reason and one reason only, to win a war. "Can you really help us?" One of the Uranthian leaders asked, trying to mask the desperation in their voice. They had been let down so many times by their own allies. Could these strangers be different? The human leader didn't hesitate. "We don't have the luxury of promises, but we can fight, and we can win. That's all we can offer." The bluntness of his words hit the Uranthians hard. It wasn't a promise of victory, but the promise of action. That was what they needed. They didn't need empty promises. They needed strength. And these humans had it. The human leader gave a nod to his crew, and without another word, they moved into action. The Uranthians had never seen anything like it. The humans didn't waste time with questions or pleasantries. They immediately started assessing the situation. They didn't look for weaknesses in the Uranthians. They looked for ways to make the best use of the resources they had. It was clear that these humans were not here to simply sit back and wait. They were here to take control of the situation. Within hours, the Uranthians saw their first demonstration of what these humans were capable of. They didn't wait for the Zlorians to come to them. The humans, using their knowledge of survival on the most dangerous planets, moved into the wild, untamed regions of the planet. They set up traps, used the natural terrain to their advantage, and began laying out battle plans in ways the Uranthians had never thought of before. The Uranthians watched as the humans prepared, and for the first time, they felt a spark of hope. These Deathworlders didn't see danger the same way everyone else did. They saw it as an opportunity. As the humans began to fortify their position, the Uranthians couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and fear. The tactics the humans used were unlike anything they had ever seen. They weren't afraid to get dirty, to use their surroundings as weapons. They made use of every advantage the terrain provided. The Uranthians had always relied on advanced technology and clean, calculated tactics. But the humans were teaching them something new, that sometimes brute strength and the willingness to fight were just as important as technology. Despite the differences between the two species, there was a strange understanding between them. The Uranthians were used to fighting with strategy, but they had never been in a war like this before. The humans showed them that sometimes the most effective strategy was to fight in ways others didn't expect. And it was working. The Zlorians, with all their technology and their advanced weaponry, didn't know how to handle the humans. The Deathworlders were unpredictable. They weren't afraid to get up close and personal with their enemies, using the terrain to their advantage in ways that the Zlorians simply weren't prepared for. As the days went on, the Uranthians began to realize something important. They were learning. The humans weren't just here to fight on their behalf. They were here to teach them how to fight. They were showing the Aranthians how to survive, how to adapt, and how to never give up. It wasn't about winning with technology or superior numbers. It was about winning with sheer willpower and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The Aranthians had always been proud of their culture and their advanced technology, but they had never been tested like this. Now they were learning to adapt. The humans had shown them that survival wasn't just about waiting for help to come. It was about taking action. Even when the odds seemed impossible. As the battle raged on, the Aranthians began to change. They weren't just relying on the humans anymore. They were starting to fight like them. They started thinking like the humans, using the environment to their advantage, setting up traps, and striking when the enemy least expected it. The more they learned from the humans, the more they realized that the only way to win was to think beyond the ordinary. With each passing day, the hope that the Aranthians had nearly lost was slowly coming back. The Deathworlders had come to their aid, and in doing so, they had given the Aranthians a new perspective on what it meant to fight, to survive, and to never give up. The war was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, the Aranthians had a reason to believe they could win. When the humans arrived, the Aranthians had expected some kind of formal meeting or a polite introduction. But the humans didn't work that way. They didn't step out of their ships with speeches or long discussions. Instead, they came out ready to work, already scanning the area with calm, serious expressions. Their movements were sharp and focused, and everything about them said they were used to being in dangerous places. The Aranthians watched from a distance at first. They had always seen themselves as peaceful thinkers, gentle, careful, and balanced. Seeing these humans up close felt like watching a different kind of life altogether. The humans walked with purpose, like people who had faced danger many times before and knew exactly how to handle it. The first thing the humans did was study the land around them. They looked at the ground, the sky, the nearby hills, and the ruined areas of the city. They didn't waste time on small talk. They didn't even seem bothered by the destroyed buildings or the damage around them. Instead, they walked forward as if this kind of environment was nothing new. They seemed to understand it instinctively. One of the Aranthian leaders quietly said, "They move like they've been here before." Another leader replied, "Not here, but somewhere like here." It was true. The humans came from what many species called Deathworld, a world filled with natural dangers, harsh weather, and countless challenges. To the Aranthians, the idea of living like that seemed impossible. But to the humans, it was simply life. That was why they had earned the title Deathworlders. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was a warning, and also a kind of respect. These were people who survived things that most civilizations couldn't even imagine. Soon, the human team began unpacking equipment. They placed small devices around the area, machines that scanned, mapped, and analyzed the surroundings. Several humans walked toward damaged buildings to check their stability, while others climbed up to higher ground to observe the landscape. Everything they did had a purpose. The Aranthians watched with fascination. They were used to delicate machines and soft tools. But the humans' tools looked strong and rugged, built to withstand rough handling. Even their clothing looked thick and sturdy, made for tough environments rather than comfort. One of the younger Aranthians whispered to a friend, "They look like they're ready to face anything." The friend nodded. "Maybe they are." Finally, after studying the terrain, the human leader approached the Aranthians. His expression wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't soft either. It was the face of someone who had seen many battles, but still chose to stand strong. He didn't waste time. "We need to understand your situation in full detail," he said. "Where the enemy is, what they want, and what resources you have left." The Aranthian leaders guided him into their command center. The room was quiet, and everyone's eyes followed the humans as they entered. The humans didn't seem intimidated by this new environment. They simply looked around, absorbing everything, their eyes sharp and steady. The Uranthians explained their situation. They had lost many regions to the enemy, and their defenses were failing. Their technology was advanced, but designed for balanced, peaceful societies, not sudden, long-term war. The Solarians had caught them off guard, and now their world was falling apart. The humans listened carefully. They didn't interrupt or react dramatically. They absorbed the information, nodding slightly every now and then. When the Uranthians finished speaking, the human leader said something that surprised everyone. "You still have a chance." The room fell silent. No one had said those words in a long time. "We've seen worse," the human leader added. "Much worse. Your world has problems, but it also has advantages. You just aren't using them the right way yet." The Uranthians exchanged confused glances. They had never thought of their world as an advantage. It was their home. Yes, but compared to the humans' harsh world, maybe it wasn't so soft after all. What advantages? A Uranthian asked. The human leader pointed toward the mountains on a holographic map. "Your terrain. Your natural environment. It's full of hiding spots, narrow paths, and unpredictable weather. You don't see it the way we do. But for people like us, this is useful." The Uranthians listened as he continued. "You've been trying to fight a clean, organized battle. But the enemy is stronger, so that won't work. What will work is using the world itself to help you. We've done this on dozens of worlds, some friendly, some not. You need to think differently now." There was something about the way the human spoke that made the Uranthians trust him. Not because of his tone, it was firm and direct, but because he sounded like someone who had survived impossible odds before. Someone who knew what he was talking about. The humans then began demonstrating what they meant. They showed the Uranthians how to use the hills and forests around them to their advantage, how to block enemy paths using natural obstacles, and how to build simple but effective barriers quickly. They even showed them how to track movements using signs in the environment, broken branches, disturbed soil, wind patterns. These were things the Uranthians had never paid attention to. Their technology had made them forget how to observe things with their own senses. The Uranthians tried to follow along. They were nervous at first. They weren't used to this kind of hands-on work. But the humans were patient, explaining things clearly, demonstrating every step slowly. They weren't harsh teachers. They were practical ones. One human told a group of young Uranthians, "Don't worry about getting everything perfect right away. Start small. Learn fast. You adapt better than you think." The words encouraged them. The humans weren't just fighting the enemy. They were helping the Uranthians grow stronger too. As the day went on, something interesting happened. The Uranthians started becoming more confident. They began to understand how to use their world differently. They started looking at their environment with new eyes, noticing slopes they could use, caves they could hide in, and paths they could block if needed. The humans seemed to sense this shift in energy. They didn't cheer or compliment the Uranthians excessively. They simply continued teaching, as if they always knew this would happen. It was as if helping others grow stronger came naturally to them. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the humans and Uranthians stood together on a high ridge. Below them, the land stretched out, scarred in some places, peaceful in others. The humans looked at the world with a steady gaze, calculating and thoughtful. The Uranthians looked at it with a mix of fear and hope. One Uranthian softly said, "I never realized our home had so much strength." A human standing near him replied, "Most people only see strength in themselves when things get difficult. Your world is the same. You just needed someone to show you." There was no arrogance in the human's voice, just calm honesty. It made the Uranthians feel comforted. As night fell, the two groups continued planning. The humans worked through the evening without complaint. They discussed ideas, offered suggestions, and adjusted plans when needed. Even though they came from a harsh world, they didn't treat the Uranthians as weak. They treated them as partners, capable of learning and becoming stronger. The Uranthians were surprised by how well the humans adapted to the planet's conditions. They didn't complain about the cold winds or the rough ground. They didn't mind sleeping in temporary shelters. They acted as though this was normal. By the end of the day, the Uranthians felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: courage. Real courage. Not the kind that came from hoping things would get better, but the kind that came from preparing for it. They still didn't know everything about these humans. They didn't know their traditions, their history, or their culture. But they did know one thing. These Deathworlders were not just strong fighters. They were survivors. And survivors made good allies. The Uranthians stood together that night, watching the stars, knowing that their world had changed forever. They were no longer alone. They had help, unexpected help. Yes, but strong, determined help that could change everything. And deep inside, a new feeling began to grow. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something far better. It was hope. The days that followed were a blur of action. The Uranthians were still processing the changes happening around them, but they couldn't ignore the new feeling that had slowly started to grow inside them. A feeling of purpose. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about adapting, learning, and surviving. The humans had sparked something in them that they hadn't felt in years. Hope. The human warriors, as they came to be called, were tireless in their efforts. They worked without rest, constantly moving, adjusting, and strategizing. Every time they found a new way to fight or defend, they shared it with the Uranthians. They taught them how to use their environment in ways the Uranthians never even imagined. How to track enemy movements, how to set traps, how to read the land like an open book. It wasn't just about military strategy, it was about survival. In the past, the Uranthians had relied on their advanced technology to keep them safe. Their cities had been protected by shields, their weapons were sophisticated, and their spaceships had the power to repel any enemy. But none of that mattered now. The Zlorians had destroyed their cities, overrun their defenses, and left them with nothing but broken technology and dwindling resources. What they had left, what they truly had, was their land. And now, with the humans showing them how to use it, the Uranthians began to realize that their world wasn't as weak as they had thought. One afternoon, the humans gathered a group of Uranthians at the edge of a dense forest. The trees towered over them, their roots thick and gnarled, creating natural obstacles in every direction. It was the perfect place for a trap, the human leader explained. The Uranthians looked around, unsure of what to do. "This is what you need to understand," the human leader said, looking at the group. "In a place like this, the enemy can't always see you. You can use the trees, the rocks, the shadows, to hide and move without being detected. But you have to think like the enemy. They'll expect you to hide in the open, where it's easy to spot you. But what if you use that to your advantage?" The humans started moving quickly, quietly, as if they had already memorized the forest's layout. They set up false trails, leading in the opposite direction from where they were actually hiding. They marked certain trees with small signs, nothing too obvious, but enough to confuse anyone trying to follow them. The Uranthians watched, amazed at the speed and efficiency of the human warriors. They worked like clockwork, each person knowing exactly what to do and where to be. They weren't just relying on their advanced tools. They were relying on their senses, on their experience, and on their knowledge of how to blend into the world around them. A young Uranthian, still uncertain about all of this, asked, "But won't this Lorian see us?" The human leader smiled, shaking his head. Not if you do it right. You're not hiding to escape them. You're hiding to control where they go. You're guiding them into traps. If they think they know where you are, they'll make mistakes. The humans' words were simple, but they carried weight. The Uranthians had always been cautious, calculating. But now they were learning to use their environment to control the situation, rather than simply reacting to it as the day wore on. The Uranthians began to practice these tactics, and slowly they got better. At first, their movements were awkward, unsure. But with every repetition, they grew more confident. The humans didn't rush them. They gave them time to practice, to get used to the idea. And when they made mistakes, the humans didn't criticize. They simply guided them back on track, offering suggestions, showing them where they could improve. By the end of the day, the young Uranthians were tired, but something in their eyes had changed. They had a new understanding of the land they had grown up on, and a new appreciation for how powerful it could be if used the right way. That night, the group sat around a fire, eating in silence. The humans didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The Uranthians looked at the fire, but their minds were elsewhere, processing everything they had learned. One of the older Uranthians spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "I never thought we would be able to turn the land against the Zlorians. We've always used technology to protect us. But now we are learning to be the ones who control our surroundings." The human leader nodded, though his face was unreadable in the dim light. "It's about more than just fighting," he said. "It's about living. The Zlorians think they can take your world, but they don't understand it. They don't understand how tough it is, how much it can fight back. That's why they're losing." As the fire crackled, the Uranthians sat in a comfortable silence, their minds buzzing with the possibilities. They weren't relying on their technology alone anymore. They were learning to fight the way the humans did not, with fancy weapons or shields, but with their wits and their strength. They were learning to adapt, to survive. And it was making all the difference. The next day, they put what they had learned into practice. The humans led them into the heart of the enemy territory, a dangerous place filled with the remnants of the old war machines the Zlorians had left behind. The area was a mix of ruined buildings and open fields, with barely any cover. But the humans showed them how to use the wreckage of the Zlorian machines, how to create new hiding spots and barriers from the debris. The Uranthians were cautious at first, still unsure of how to make these new tactics work. But the humans were patient. They didn't push them. They just showed them how to think differently. After a few hours of practice, they were ready. The Zlorians were coming. And for the first time, the Uranthians felt ready to face them. As the enemy approached, the Uranthians slipped into position, using the wreckage to hide themselves, blending into the surroundings. They watched as the Zlorians moved closer, their armored troops unaware of the traps that lay ahead. When the Zlorians finally passed the first trap, the Uranthians struck. It wasn't a huge battle. There were no explosions, no flashing weapons. It was quiet, quick, and efficient. The Uranthians didn't attack head-on. They used the environment to their advantage, guiding the Zlorians into areas where they couldn't escape. The human warriors had taught them how to move fast, how to use the terrain to block the enemy's movements, and how to strike at the right moment. And it worked. The first victory felt small, but to the Uranthians, it was a huge achievement. They hadn't relied on technology or advanced weapons. They had used their wits, their skills, and their land. They had taken control instead of waiting to be saved. That night, the human leader smiled, though it wasn't a proud smile. It was a quiet acknowledgement of what had been achieved. The Uranthians had taken the first step. They had learned the most important lesson, that survival wasn't about waiting for the enemy to make mistakes. It was about making sure they never got the chance. as the stars filled the sky. The Eranthians stood tall, knowing they had the strength to fight back. They weren't just a civilization waiting to be saved anymore. They were becoming warriors in their own right. They were learning how to stand strong and how to win. And in that moment, surrounded by the humans who had shown them how, they felt like they had a future again. A future they could control. In the days that followed their first small victory, something shifted deeply within the Eranthians. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. They no longer felt like helpless survivors waiting for another disaster. They felt like people who could shape their own future. The humans had shown them what they were capable of, and now the Eranthians were beginning to believe in themselves again. Even so, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The Zlorians had suffered losses, and they never reacted quietly to such things. Everyone knew they would return soon, stronger, angrier, and more prepared. The humans didn't hide this truth. They were honest. But their honesty wasn't meant to scare anyone. It was meant to prepare them. The Eranthians spent their mornings training, their afternoons scouting, and their evenings planning. Every day brought new lessons. The humans didn't train them the way traditional armies did. They didn't give them heavy armor or complicated weapons. They trained them to think, to observe, to understand the enemy before reacting. One morning, the human leader gathered the Eranthians near a large canyon that stretched across the landscape. It looked like nothing more than a crack in the earth, vast, dry, and silent. But the humans saw it differently. They saw opportunity. "This place can protect you," the leader explained, "but it can also trap you if you don't know how to use it." The Eranthians listened closely. The canyon walls rose sharply on both sides, and the ground was uneven, full of loose rocks and narrow paths. It seemed dangerous, especially for a group that wasn't used to moving on unstable ground. But slowly, as the humans demonstrated ways to travel safely, the Eranthians began to understand. One of them tested the ground, noticing how certain stones shifted under weight while others held firm. They practiced moving silently along the canyon edge, using the rocks to mask their presence. They learned how to read the wind, how sound traveled differently inside the canyon, and how to signal to each other without speaking. They were clumsy at first. Some slipped, some made noise. But the humans didn't laugh or get frustrated. They simply corrected them, guiding them step by step until the Eranthians felt more confident. By midday, the Eranthians had learned enough to move through the canyon without fear. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And more importantly, they were learning to trust themselves in unfamiliar environments. After the training, the humans led them to a small cave hidden beneath an overhang of rocks. It was barely noticeable unless someone pointed it out. Inside, the cave opened into a wide space that seemed almost untouched. The walls were smooth, and faint light filtered in from tiny cracks above. "This," the leader said, "is a safe point, a place you can fall back to if things go wrong. But you must remember something important. Never rely on one safe point. Always have more than one way out." The Eranthians understood. They spent the rest of the day marking paths, subtle marks only they would recognize. A scratch on a stone, a twisted plant stem, a shape carved into the dirt. Nothing too obvious, but enough to guide them if they ever needed to escape quickly. The more they worked, the more their confidence grew. They were no longer moving only because the humans told them to. They were taking initiative, thinking ahead, discussing ideas among themselves. The humans watched quietly, offering support when needed, but not interfering. That night, as the group sat together near a dim fire, a quiet calm settled over them. The air was cool, and the sky above them was filled with bright stars. The humans sat nearby, sharpening tools and quietly observing the horizon. They didn't speak much, but the Eranthians had learned that silence from the humans didn't mean something was wrong. It meant they were focused. One of the younger Uranthians looked at the humans and asked quietly, "Do you ever get afraid?" The leader looked up, surprised by the question. He thought for a moment before answering. "Everyone gets afraid," he said simply. "Fear is natural. What matters is what you do with it. If you let fear control you, it will stop you from seeing the truth. But if you face it, even just a little, fear becomes a guide." The answer stayed with the Uranthians long after the conversation ended. They weren't used to thinking of fear as something useful. For most of their lives, fear had meant danger, something to hide from. But now, they were beginning to understand that facing fear didn't make someone weak. It made them stronger. The next morning, scouts returned with news. These Lorians had been spotted near the plains. Their numbers were larger than before. Their machines were active again, and they were heading toward the canyon. The atmosphere changed instantly. There was no shouting or panic, but a sharp alertness took over everyone present. The Uranthians felt the familiar rush of anxiety, but this time they did not freeze. They had learned too much to fall back into fear. The humans moved quickly, gathering everyone and outlining a plan. It wasn't a plan anyone would call perfect, but it was clear, simple, and based on everything they had practiced. The goal wasn't to defeat the Zlorians outright. That would take time and far more coordination. The goal was to slow them down, weaken them, and force them to rethink their movements. The humans wanted the Zlorians to feel uncertain. They wanted them to doubt themselves, just like they had done to the Uranthians for years. The Uranthians took their positions along the canyon edge. Their hearts pounded, but their hands were steady. They had practiced this. They knew the land now. They understood how to move through it with control dot as the Zlorians entered the canyon. Their machines hummed loudly, echoing off the canyon walls. The sound was overwhelming, but the Uranthians stayed silent, hidden behind rocks and shadows. They waited for the right moment, not too early and not too late. When the humans gave the signal, the Uranthians triggered the first part of their plan. It wasn't an attack. It was a distraction. Loose rocks fell from the canyon walls, creating noise and dust clouds. The Zlorians paused, confused, unsure if it was natural or planned. Then the Uranthians moved again, guiding the enemy deeper into the canyon where the path narrowed. The humans had shown them that the narrower the path, the harder it would be for the machines to maneuver. And it worked. The Zlorians slowed down, their machines struggling to stay balanced, but the Uranthians didn't fight face to face. They stayed, hidden, using the land to control the enemy's direction. Every move was planned. Every step mattered. And as the Zlorians grew more tangled in the narrow paths, their formation broke. For the first time, the Uranthians watched the enemy become confused. The humans stepped in only when necessary, making sure the Zlorians didn't regain control. Their movements were calm, precise, and steady. They didn't take risks. They didn't try to be heroes. They just focused on protecting the Uranthians and keeping the plan on track. By the end of the day, the Zlorians had been forced to retreat, not because of an overwhelming attack, but because they couldn't navigate the land the Uranthians were learning to reclaim. When the last of the enemy machines disappeared into the distance, the Uranthians felt a wave of relief wash over them. They were tired, bruised, and covered in dust, but they had succeeded. They had protected their territory without losing themselves to fear. The humans didn't celebrate loudly. They simply nodded at the Uranthians with a sense of quiet approval. It wasn't victory. It was progress. And progress was exactly what they needed. That night, the Uranthians gathered together, feeling a strange yet powerful sense of pride. They talked about what they had done right, what they could improve, and what the next steps might be. The humans listened, letting them lead. Something important had changed. The Uranthians were no longer students waiting for instructions. They were partners now, equal in responsibility, equal in determination, equal in spirit. And deep down, everyone knew the truth. The real battle had not yet begun. But for the first time in a long time, the Aranthians felt like they could face whatever came next. Days passed, and the calm after the battle hung in the air, like the stillness before a storm. The Zorians had retreated, but everyone knew they wouldn't stay away for long. In fact, the Aranthians didn't expect them to stay away at all. The battle in the canyon had been a success, but it had been small. The Zorians were powerful and persistent, and they weren't the type to simply give up. The human warriors, however, weren't worried. They were preparing. They didn't speak much about the future, but it was clear in the way they moved, the way they gathered, and the way they trained. They were ready for whatever came next. The Aranthians, now far more confident in their abilities, trained alongside them, learning new tactics and refining old ones. The next step was clear. It was time to take the fight to the enemy. The humans had explained to the Aranthians that simply defending wasn't enough. The Zorians would only keep coming, wearing them down until they finally found a way to break through. The best defense was a good offense. They needed to disrupt the Zorians before they had the chance to regroup and rebuild their strength. At first, the idea of attacking felt strange to the Aranthians. They had spent so much time running and hiding that the thought of going on the offensive seemed almost impossible. But the humans didn't make it sound like an impossible task. They broke it down into smaller steps the Aranthians could take. It wasn't about charging headfirst into battle. It was about outsmarting the Zorians, striking when they least expected it. The humans had taught them how to plan. They weren't just throwing the Aranthians into a fight. They were giving them the tools to outmaneuver the enemy. It was about patience. Every attack had to be calculated. They needed to hit fast, disappear quickly, and leave the Zorians guessing. One day, after a long training session, the human leader called the group together. It was time. They had identified a weak point in the Zorian defense, an area where their machines had to travel through a narrow valley to reach the Aranthians' last known position. The humans knew that if the Aranthians could set up an ambush in the right spot, they could do significant damage without ever having to face the enemy head-on. The plan was simple. The Aranthians would hide along the valley walls, blending in with the environment. They would wait for the Zorians to move into the trap, and when they did, the humans would give the signal. The Aranthians would strike, using everything they had learned about the land to create chaos. The Zorians would be confused, vulnerable, and when the battle was over, the Aranthians would be gone, just as quickly as they had arrived. The Aranthians were nervous. This wasn't just another defensive move. This was an attack. But as the humans explained the strategy in simple terms, they started to feel more confident. They knew the land. They knew the Zorians. And they knew their enemies' weaknesses. For the first time, they had the upper hand. The morning of the attack arrived, and the air felt different. The Aranthians, usually so reserved and cautious, moved with purpose. They worked silently, efficiently, setting up their positions along the valley walls. The humans moved among them, checking and rechecking their work, but they didn't interfere. They trusted the Aranthians to get it right. This was their moment, their chance to show how far they had come. When the Zorians appeared in the distance, it felt like time slowed. The Aranthians could see the enemy machines moving through the valley, their armored soldiers walking in formation, their heavy boots kicking up dust. The humans signaled, and the Aranthians went into position. They waited, holding their breath, staying as still as possible. Everything depended on this moment. The first Zorian soldiers passed beneath the Aranthians' positions without noticing them. The trap was set. Then, without warning, the human leader signaled again. The Aranthians moved quickly, silently, each one executing their part of the plan. They didn't charge in. Instead, They created confusion. Small explosive devices, carefully placed along the valley walls, erupted in a controlled series of blasts. The explosions didn't destroy anything significant, but they startled the Zilorians, throwing them off balance. As the Zilorians hesitated, unsure of what was happening, the Eranthians struck. They threw rocks and debris from above, disorienting the soldiers below. The Zilorians scrambled, trying to locate the source of the attack, but by the time they realized where it was coming from, it was already too late. The Eranthians had vanished into the terrain, retreating as quickly as they had arrived. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Zilorians had been confused, disorganized, and forced to retreat. And once again, the Eranthians were left with no casualties. They hadn't fought head-to-head. They hadn't charged into the enemy ranks. They had simply used the terrain, the land, and their new skills to disrupt the Zilorians and send them back. That night, the group gathered by a fire, their faces lit by the warm glow. No one spoke at first. They were all still processing what had just happened. But then the leader spoke up. "You did well," the human leader said, looking at the group with quiet approval. This wasn't about brute force. This was about precision, about knowing when to move and when to stay still. You showed the Zilorians that you're not just surviving, you're adapting. You're fighting back. The Eranthians exchanged glances, their faces still a little stunned by their own success. For so long, they had been a people on the run. Now they were something else. They were a force. And though they didn't feel like warriors in the traditional sense, they were beginning to understand what it meant to be one. It wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest. It was about using what you had and learning how to make the land work for you. The next few days were quiet. The Zilorians didn't return right away, and the Eranthians knew it meant they were planning something larger. The humans had warned them that the enemy would likely regroup and try again, but this time with more force. The Eranthians didn't let their guard down. They continued training, refining their tactics. They knew the Zilorians would come back, but they also knew they were ready for them. As the days stretched on, the Eranthians began to notice something else. It wasn't just their skills in combat that had improved. It was their sense of community, their connection to one another. They were no longer just individuals trying to survive. They were a team, a collective force working toward a shared goal. They trusted each other, depended on each other. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rebuilding. And in a quiet moment, as they looked around the fire at one another, they understood something profound. The humans had given them more than just fighting techniques. They had given them hope. They had given them the strength to stand up and fight for what was theirs. But most importantly, they had given them something the Eranthians had lost long ago, a sense of belonging, a sense of unity. And with that, the Eranthians knew they could face anything that came their way. Even the next assault from the Xlorians. The fight was far from over. But the Eranthians were ready.